Hello there. I'm Scylla Quinones, and this is Worn, a podcast about labor, self-discovery, growth, and ultimately, poverty. Poverty has everything to do with people, from culture to quality of life and education. You name it, and it affects it. We take the approach here that poverty isn't a single facet financial issue. It's complex. And those of us who have lived through it or are living in it, we deserve to have respectful conversations around it and be acknowledged. We may feel worn, but at the end of the day, we're still here with ever-evolving stories. Join me today in talking about some of May's 2020 current events. Poverty is systematic. It can last a lifetime. It can be passed down through generations. And as a society, we have largely considered this a financial issue. And because of that, it can severely be overlooked when discussing current events. This year has been incredibly difficult for everyone on a global scale. We are living through a pandemic. We are living through a historical moment. And up until 2020, when this really hit global levels, all responses to a major pandemic had been hypothetical. Now, back in 2018, I actually came across the term Disease X. That is the hypothetical, what if a virus or disease goes global situation that the scientific community has been theoretically preparing for. And they've been doing this for years. I know that if you were to go on Netflix now, they released a documentary on it back in 2019. I believe it was like October, right as, weirdly enough, right as COVID-19 really started to blossom. And it has a lot of really good information. In general, I recommend Googling the term because I am by no means a scientist, which means I am not an accurate source for the science behind this. However, I found it very fascinating when I first discovered the term, started reading up on all these theoretical ways that we could solve or find a solution for a major disease, but also I found it interesting the things that they were talking about, different aspects of life that it would affect. And the thing I learned that I took away with that for me was interesting was that a lot of researchers reached out to different economists to involve them in their research, to involve them in these scenarios, and discuss what potential dangers there could be for the economy. Now, obviously, economists worldwide all pretty much came to the conclusion this would not be very good for our economy on a global scale. But one of the major things that they pointed out was the dangers of having inadequate resources for those in poverty, and how not having a plan for people who do not and cannot afford for a pandemic to occur could actually amplify and worsen pandemics. And it all came down to, this is pre-2020, it all came down to if disease X doesn't kill them, preventing it will. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, unfortunately, 2020 has come, and we have a couple of answers for you. And that is, you can actually look to LA Times. They published an article on May 11th on the subject, discussing the effects of the pandemic on the global poverty community. and how the lockdowns, social distancing, and general measures of safety taken worldwide is leading to starvation on a global level. There are people who need help and they're not getting it. Meanwhile, on the other side of this equation, you have a lot of people living in poverty who are violating the general measures of safety because they're trying to survive. They are at higher risk of infection than anybody else. And we're seeing that, a good example here in the US, a lot of people are getting put in higher risk because they are what we've deemed essential workers. It's a reality. But in a lot of countries, and even here in the US, it happens. It's just not necessarily as spoken about, I would say. But a lot of communities that are impoverished, they help each other a lot. They take care of each other's kids when they go to work. There are food kitchens here. A lot of people just come to someone's house and they'll feed the whole neighborhood. Those are things that are still very much a part of the world community. And all of them are at higher risk because all it takes is one person to go to a job and come in contact with someone who's infected. And that's it. Now, the big thing for me about this is, one, this is absolutely something that has been theorized before. This is something that we have predicted before COVID happened. And the article in the LA Times had this really great quote that I felt perfectly encompass what's going on a global scale. And that is that this pandemic has been like, quote, watching a slow-moving train wreck as it moves through the world's most fragile countries, unquote. That was said by Nancy Limborg. She's the president of the nonprofit U.S. Institute of Peace, and she's the former head of the Ebola Task Force at the U.S. Agency for International Development. So Nancy has experience with a major virus. And honestly, I think it always takes being in a worse situation to realize how well other situations took. Like, Ebola was so serious, and somehow it didn't hit the same critical mass that COVID-19 is. So in a lot of ways, the measures taken globally with that, today we can say that they did a better job than we're doing now. And I think that's something that we can say that we learned. Now, on the other side, because LA Times, their article is very much discussions of what's happening in communities across the world. Some of their highlights are Guatemala, India, parts of Mexico. I highly recommend reading it. I will be linking it in the show notes. But the flip side to that would be looking at the numbers of the economy. So I also read an article from Bloomberg in their economics section that was published on May 13th, stating that, quote, the COVID-19 pandemic is projected to remove 4 years of global economy, unquote. It is an overwhelming feeling to read that. And for me, it was an overwhelming feeling to consider some of the facts that the Bloomberg put in there. Like, they're projecting that the global GDP is going to be reduced by 3.2%. Doesn't seem like a lot until you consider that means that the pandemic will likely cause about 34.3 million people to fall back below poverty line in 2020. And from what the article discussed, it pulled segments from a recent UN report in which more than half of this fall below poverty line is going to be African countries. And to me, that is absolutely devastating, because we have tried so hard, as far as global communities are concerned, to help various countries, and especially across Africa, to help them stabilize. And it's devastating how this pandemic is going to affect them. And a step closer to home here in the US, on May 12th, there was an article published in TC-POM, they're part of the US Today network, discussing the recent ALICE report. Now, ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed, and it's published by the United Way. It's a way to better understand challenged and often overlooked populations, and it kind of serves to provide each one of United Way's locations with more data to promote stronger, more resilient communities. And in this article, they say, quote, 1/3 of Floridians are one step away from poverty amidst COVID-19, unquote. What one step away has always meant in terms of poverty is that a family or an individual is one emergency away from financial ruin. And I absolutely am 110% in that category. If I were to go to the hospital, there would be no way for me to pay my rent. There's no way for me to financially take care of myself. I am one emergency away from losing everything in my life. And the scary thing about this report is that it does not count about 13% of Florida households who are already in poverty. So 1/3 of people who are above poverty line, meaning not necessarily middle class, but not impoverished either, they're all at risk now. The report also identifies families that, despite having jobs, can't pay for basic expenses like food, housing, healthcare. So, and that's the other thing about the wonderful thing that is our system today. When we talk about poverty line, we talk about people who are in deep poverty. As a whole, people who are above poverty line are not middle class. They are still considered impoverished. Because, as this report identifies, there are families who are not considered already in poverty that have jobs but still cannot afford food or housing or healthcare, transportation, or any of those things. And at the moment, they are predicting, according to this report, that at the rate of inflation, at the moment, in a single adult making $24,600 a year, you are at poverty level. And by that basis, I'm at poverty level still. The number of ALICE households have increased 22% since 2007. while poverty levels have remained largely flat, it's a little poverty in Florida is very uneven compared to other parts of the US. And I just feel like these 3 articles really establish what's going on. And I think it's important to be cautious, to be aware of these 3 perspectives, because there is what's going on globally. There is an economic, numerical side to consider. And then there is considering your own backyard, what's going on here. Another great article that I read is actually from Vox, V-O-X, and it's titled COVID-19 Could Reverse Decades of Global Progress. And in it, they highlight 8 examples of how COVID-19 and the pandemic safety measure responses have been affecting the world. And they make some phenomenal highlights in it. For example, they discuss vaccinations and how this has disrupted children getting their vaccinations and how much worse it's going to get without these things. However, they also discuss how there are many people who are avoiding going to the doctors when they really need to. There are patients that are actively avoiding going to the doctor that are presenting symptoms of heart attacks and stroke. Similarly, there are a lot of patients that are having life-saving surgeries completely postponed because hospitals have to make the choice between keeping ventilators and ICU beds free for COVID-19 patients. And they also have to consider the risk of exposing a patient to these conditions, because if anything goes wrong in that hospital that's treating COVID-19 patients, that means completely healthy individuals who came in for cancer surgeries or for lung transplants or general organ transplants, there's a possibility of them getting sick. And then on top of that recovery, now they have to recover from experiencing a disease or a virus in this case. They also cover they're nicknaming it or calling it the hunger pandemic. Another word that's being used, or another phrase being used, is the poverty tsunami that this is causing. And they don't go too in depth. After reading those other articles, their coverage of it is not the best. But I appreciate that they put it in there, because if you're interested, at least you have a place to start, you know? Other things I highlight is the fact that people are trying to treat COVID-19 at home as a secondary infectious respiratory issue, and they're taking antibiotics, and in that misguided effort to protect themselves against corona, they are accidentally making themselves antibiotic resistant, which means when bacteria evolve and they adapt to the antibiotics, now those antibiotics can't kill them anymore. And in the long term, someone who is antibiotic resistant, it's problematic for them to receive real assistance and to be able to address any future illnesses if their body's just not going to respond to the treatments. And of course, with everything being put on pause, that means research is also getting put on pause. A lot of clinical trials that are almost, or like they're so close to just getting through, they're all on pause. And for people who are immunocompromised, they depend on the success of these trials. They depend on getting enrolled in clinical trials because it could be life-saving to them. Otherwise, they also touch on the fact that a lot of Americans have been obsessing over the possibility of a meat shortage. And with millions of animals being killed on the farms, but not having that meat sold because not very many people are going to the store, it's completely going to waste. So, in general, the system of how we get our meat to eat definitely has needed a reform. They bring a really strong point about the fact that at this point we are being wasteful and very, very, I don't want to say unconscious about it, but just the overreaction, and I do consider it an overreaction to the meat shortage, is likely going to actually cause it. And the last thing they really cover is that vulnerable populations are getting hit harder than usual. Now, the reason for this is that everything we discussed in the other articles, everything that they highlighted, it all comes down to there are different segments in our society that experience higher levels of homelessness, higher levels of poverty, higher levels of violence in their lives. And now they are in situations where they can't really do much about it. So, for example, something that's happening across the U.S. right now is that the National Domestic Violence Hotline is getting so many more reports while people are in quarantine, because now you have women and girls and boys and men stuck with their abusers at home. You have folks from the LGBT community stuck with not such great family members. You have people who are homeless who really can't do anything about the pandemic other than live through it. And then you have a lot of people of color who are living in impoverished areas, who are not receiving the care that they need and they deserve. You have a lot of things that are intersecting at this point. And I think it's really important to, I will say, when they did this highlight, it's actually number 7 and not the last one. They made the animals the last one. I feel number 7 should have, vulnerable populations, should have been the last one, because this is the big picture at the end of the day. When it comes to understanding what's going on, it is really, really good to understand the details and then look at the big picture on how it's affecting everyone. However, the big picture needs details because you need to understand how the big picture happens. How they wrote the article aside, it's really good if you just want a general understanding of what's going on, and sometimes it isn't for everyone to be obsessed with knowing exactly what's going on, but for some people, they do find it very comforting to be certain of this is what's going on, this is all the information I have. I kind of find it funny. I pandemic's not funny, but a response to the pandemic that I have found funny is that a few years ago I had read World War Z, and one of the things that occurred in the book was that there were a lot of people that when the zombie pandemic happened, they became obsessed with learning as much as they could. And one of the characters that that was interviewed by the author in the book, the way he described it makes me laugh now, because I have a friends group that is very much like that. Every day they have an update. Every day there's like something new to read on it. And one of them's really into science. He has, I want to say it's a bio something degree. Sorry for not knowing entirely. But the point is, they're obsessed with keeping track and knowing what's going on. And it reminds me of that book, and it reminds me of why that book is just so good. And if you need a fantasy escape, I highly recommend that one, because it's interesting to see how people react, but also it's kind of interesting to see how many have predicted a situation like this would go, which is originally why I got into reading about Disease X, even though now it feels a little bit like, darn, I feel like I should have been more prepared. But at the end of the day, there's no way to prepare for what we're going through right now, other than to take it day by day and reach out to our friends and stay involved. Next up is going to be this episode's mood. Enjoy!
I got blood on my hands right now, and I'm stumbling through the dark in the dawn. I have found new ways, but no, I can't be the one that you need. Yeah, you know what I've done in the past. Still you say you and I, we can last. I have found new ways, but no, can I be the one that you need? Then I changed my mind. Maybe we got time to make this right. Can I be the one that you need? Maybe if I change the way I love it, maybe if I try to fix this heart, then I could have stayed the night, I could have called you mine. I can't be the one that you need. Maybe if I change the way I love it, maybe if I try to fix this heart, then I could have stayed the night, I could have called you mine. Can I be the one that you need? Maybe if I change the way I love it, maybe if I try to fix this heart, then I could have stayed the night, I could have called you mine. Can I be the one that you need? I got blood on my hands right now, and I'm stumbling through the dark in the dawn. I have found new ways, but no, I can't be the one that you need. Yeah, you know what I've done in the past. Still you say you and I, we can last. I have found new ways, but no, can I be the one that you need? Then I changed my mind. Maybe we got time to make this right. Can I be the one that you need? Maybe if I change the way I love it, maybe if I try to fix this heart, then I could have stayed the night, I could have called you mine. I can't be the one that you need. Maybe if I change the way I
And that was If I Change by Mind Me, Grib, featuring Maya Prifman. You can find them on Apple Music, Spotify, Amazon Music, Pandora, and a few other sites. You can check out our show notes to find their direct links, along with all the sources for the articles that we covered today. Please remember, here at Warren, our submissions for the mood is open. If you'd like to submit something, go ahead. And in general, you can contact me for any topics, questions, anything at all that you would like to hear covered. You can reach out to us on Anchor, Facebook, Tumblr, or email. Be sure to like, favorite, follow, or subscribe to be notified whenever there is a new episode posted. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be seeing you later.